Okay, good morning, class. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about research methodology, and we start with part one. Okay, so let's actually start with the class today. These are our learning objectives that we have, right, in this part. So we start with the key differences between research method and research methodology. Now, when we say research, method, we are talking of the methods which our researchers use for collecting data to conduct research on a particular research topic, whereas methodology is a systematic approach to solve the research problem and to come to a new conclusion. So methodology is the logic behind using that method, right? So in research method, the objective is to find solution. For methodology, the objective is to determine the solution by applying the correct procedures of research. Research methods are useful to apply during the latter stage of the research process, whereas methodologies are applied at the initial stage of the research being conducted. Research methods are a small part of research methodology, whereas a research methodology is a multidimensional concept. These research methods comprises of various techniques where various studies and experiments are used to conduct research and to reach an appropriate conclusion, whereas methodologies are used during the initial stage of research to explain the purpose of the chosen methods and how they will serve its function. Methods consist of different investigation techniques. Methodology is a systematic strategy to achieve the decided objective. Methods comprises of carrying out an experiment, survey, test, and so on and so forth. Whereas methodology, it comprises of different techniques which are used during the performance of these experiments, surveys, tests, and so on and so forth. So this is how we talk of the research process. The first stage is where you actually find out do an observation to find out the broad area of research identified. Then comes up the preliminary data gathering where you're talking of literature survey. Then from there you come up with your problems, research problem comes up, and then we do an intensive critical review on that problem. Then we actually talk of the deduction theoretical framework comes up, where all the variables are clearly identified and labeled, and from there you come up with your hypothesis. And once the hypothesis is done, then you come up with your research design. You design it, and based on that, the data collection, analysis, and interpretation comes. And from there, you have when we do it, so we interpret it can be either through induction or deduction. But the way induction is where we know this, where we talk of whether the research question is answered, whereas deduction talks of whether the hypothesis is substantiated as well as whether research question is answered. And if it is no, it doesn't happen, either of this, then what happens is we start again with this procedure. It goes on, right, till we come to a yes. And it is done when we actually achieve, when our target, that is our research question being answered, hypothesis being substantiated, then we write the report and it's presented, based on which the managerial decision is being made. So we are talking of research design. What is it? It's a set of methods and procedures which is used for collecting and analyzing measures of variables which are specified in the problem research. So the study of when we go for a research and a research study, design of a study, it actually defines the study type. For example, it could be descriptive, correlation, experimental review, subtypes, whether it's descriptive, longitudinal case study, research problem, hypothesis, independent and dependent variables, experimental design, and if applicable, data collection methods, and a statistical analysis plan. So in other words, when we talk of research design, it's a framework that has been created to find out answers to all the research questions. So What is research design? It refers to the overall strategy that we choose as a researcher to integrate the different components of study in a very coherent and logical way, which would ensure that we will be effectively addressing the research problem. And it constitutes the blueprint for the collection, measurement, and analysis of data. So, research design is the blueprint based on which data collection, measurement, and analysis goes on. Please note that your research problem determines the type of design you use, not the other way around. Okay, based on your research problem, you decide what sort of, based on your research problem, you decide what sort of research design you will be using. So, research design is a framework of research methods and techniques which is chosen by us as a researcher, which allows us to hone in on our research methods that are suitable for the subject matter and which sets up their studies for set up their studies up for success. Okay, so when we design a research topic, it explains the type of research, that is experimental survey, correlation, semi-experimental review, and also the subtypes, right? Which is experimental design, research problem, descriptive case study. So there are three main types of research design, right? Uh, which include data collection, measurement, and analysis. The type of research problem that an organization is facing will be determining the research design based on the type of organization, based on the type of problem the organization and the problem that it faces, that determines the research design. And it's not the other way around, that research design helps you in actually finding out what the research problem is. It's a research problem of that organization. Every organization is unique, their problem is unique. That helps in determining what sort of research design we want to. So the design phase of a study determines which tools to use and how they would be used. And impactful research design usually creates a minimum bias in data, increases trust in the accuracy of the collected tool, and it all any design that produces the least margin of error in experimental research is generally considered the best desired outcome. Okay, so the essential elements of the research design are accurate purpose statement, techniques that needs to be implemented for collecting and analyzing research, the method applied for analyzing collected details, the type of research methodology, probable objections for research, settings for the research study, the timeline for the research, the measurement of analysis, and proper research designs which sets your study for success. Any successful research studies provide insights that are accurate and unbiased. And we need to create a survey that meets all the main characteristics of design. So, what are the four main characteristics of design? One is neutrality. When you set up your study, you have to make assumptions about the data that you expect to collect, and the results projected in your research design should be free from all bias. Okay, and it should be neutral. So you need to understand opinions about the final evaluated scores and conclusion from multiple individuals. One person is not enough, and consider those who agree with your results that you have derived. Next comes up is reliability. So with the regularly conducted research, the researcher involved expects similar results every time, right? Your design would actually indicate how to form research questions. Design tells us how to form research questions, which would ensure the standard of results. You'll be able to reach the expected results only if your design is reliable. This is very, very important. Okay. Next comes up is validity. Now, there are multiple measuring tools available, but only the correct measuring tools are those which will be helping you in coming in actually analyzing the results according to the objective of the research. Then the questionnaire developed from this design will then be valid. The fourth point is generalization. Now, the outcome of your design should apply to a population, that entire population, and not just to a restricted sample. So when you can do that, that's called a generalized design, which implies that your survey can be conducted on any part of the population with similar accuracy. Okay. So, what are the functions of a research design? The function is mainly to ensure that the evidence obtained that you get, the or evidence that you're obtaining, it helps you to effectively address the research problem as unambiguously as possible, right? In social sciences, what happens when you obtain evidence relevant to your research problem? It actually talks about specifying the type of evidence needed to test a theory, evaluate a program, to accurately describe a phenomenon. But what happens is researchers often begin their investigations far too early before they have actually thought critically about what information is required to answer your research questions. So when you do that, then what happens is there can be issues that comes up. You can come up with problems, and what the main issue that comes up is that your conclusions that you come up is very weak and it's unconvincing, right? And hence it will also fail to address the overall research problem. So, given this, the length and complexity of research designs can vary considerably. But any sound research design should have the following points. These are the points where first it should identify the research problem clearly and justify its selection, review previously published literature associated with the problem area, clearly and explicitly specify the hypothesis, that's your research questions, which is related to the problem selected, effectively describe the data which will be necessary for an adequate test of hypothesis, and explain how such data is obtained, and describe the methods of analysis which will be applied to the data in determining whether or not the hypothesis is true or false. So there can be different types of research design, right? And a researcher must have a clear understanding of the different types of research design to select which one would be applicable for their study and then implement it, right? So research design can be broadly classified into quantitative and qualitative. Qualitative research design, it determines the relationship between the collected data and observations based on mathematical calculations. Okay, so theories which are related to a natural existing phenomenon can be proved or disproved using statistical methods, right? We as researchers, we rely on qualitative research design methods which conclude with why a particular theory exists, along with what your respondents have to say with it. Why is important. Whereas on the other hand, when we talk of quantitative research design, it is used for cases where statistical conclusions are done to collect some actionable insights. Okay, so that's where we use it. That's for cases where we need to come up with some statistical conclusions to collect where we use where the statistical conclusions are important to collect actionable insights. So numbers here is important. Numbers provide a better perspective for making critical business decisions, right? It's important for the growth of any organizations, right? Insights drawn from numerical data and analysis, they prove to be very effective while making decisions related to the future of any business. So the research designs, that was the two broad types of research designs, that's quantitative and qualitative. But if you can break it down, these are the different types of research designs that we have. First is action research design, where the essentials of action research design is to follow a characteristic style where initially an exploratory stance is adopted, where an understanding of the problem is developed, a plan, and then plans are made for some form of interventionary strategy. And then the intervention is actually carried out. So this is the action in research, action in action research, during which time there are observations are done, there are pertinent observations are done, and they are collected in and they are done in different forms. The new interventional strategies are then carried out, and the cyclic process that's been repeated until a sufficient understanding or of the problem is actually achieved, right? Then this protocol is cyclical in nature, which is intended to foster a deeper understanding of a given situation. It starts from conceptualizing and particularizing the problem and then moving through several interventions and evaluations. What do these studies tell us? Firstly, a collaborative and adaptive research design. It's a collaborative and adaptive research design which lends itself to use in work on community situations. It focuses on pragmatic and solution-driven research rather than testing theories. When practitioners use this research, it has the potential to increase the amount they learned consciously from their experience. So it's learning cycle, learning by experience. It often have direct and obvious relevance to practice, and there are no hidden controls or preemption of direction by the researcher. What these studies don't tell us. It's harder to do than conducting conventional studies. Why? Because the researcher takes on responsibilities for encouraging change as well as for research. It's much harder, not harder, but harder to write up. Why? Because you probably don't use a standard format to report your findings effectively. Personal over-involvement of the researcher may lead to some biased results. And the cyclical nature of this research to achieve twin outcomes. Twin outcomes of one is action, that's change, and the other is research, that is understanding, is time consuming and complex to conduct because you're asking for looking out for two different outcomes, action as well as research. So there are many methods of conducting action research. Some of these are observing individuals or groups, right? You analyze and collect and analyze data, then using audio and video recording. Then you can use structured or semi-structured interviews, taking field notes, using analytic memoing, using or taking photography, distributing questionnaires and surveys. So you observe, then reflect and share, then identify the problem, devise a plan, and act to implement your plan. Okay. So example of action research is, imagine that you're interested in examining a specific problem that happens in school, in your school. So for that, you need to identify a problem that sample girls lose their confidence in their math abilities when they reach middle school. So you devise a plan, first the problem, then the plan, then you start implementing the plan, right? And then plan is where you develop an intervention for teachers to help increase their self-efficacy of female students. Implementing is where have the teachers conduct the intervention for 2 quarters, then observe the outcome, where you circulate surveys questioning how the students rate their math competency, and then reflect on the process, where you note whether the intervention was successful or not and discuss possible areas of improvement. After writing down the 5 steps on paper, then reflect on the process and how effective you think your action research was. So you have this research, this video, which actually tells you on the process of action research. Next, case research design. It's an in-depth study of a particular research problem, rather than a sweeping statistical survey, which is often used to narrow down a broad field of research into one or few easily researchable examples, right? Which is useful for testing whether a specific theory and model actually applies to a particular phenomena in the real world. And it's also useful when not much is known about that particular phenomena. These studies actually tells us tells us a lot of things. Firstly, it helps us in having a clear understanding of the complex issue through detailed contextual analysis of a limited number of events or conditions and their relationships. So it can apply a variety of methodologies and rely on a variety of sources to investigate the research problem. It can extend experience or add strength to what is already known through previous research. Social scientists usually use this type of research design for examining contemporary real life situations and provide the basis for application of concepts and theories and extension of methods. And this can also provide detailed descriptions of specific and rare cases. So these studies actually offers little basis for establishing reliability or to generalize the findings for a wider population. The intense exposure to the study of the case may actually bias a researcher's interpretation of findings. It does not facilitate assessment of the cause and effect relationships. That cannot be done. Okay, vital information may be missing here, which becomes difficult to interpret the case. The case may not be representative or typical of a larger problem being investigated. And if the criteria for the selecting a case, if is because it represents a very unusual or unique phenomena or problem for study, then what happens? Your interpretations in that case will be only applying to that particular case and it cannot be generalized, right? So this is an example. So let's say that Mel decides to study creative people who are highly successful. So she wants to know the process they use to come up with creative works. And she convinces a very famous and a creative businessman to let her shadow him for several months. So that she can observe and interview him and get a feel of what his life is. So Mel is actually, what she's doing is she's putting a case study or a detailed analysis of a single person or a group and its relationship to phenomena. Okay, so here what Mel is doing, she's wants to look and go in depth at the businessman and his relationship to creativity. So where she's interested in seeing what makes him creative. Okay, so this is an example. And generally, there are three reasons that for people performing case studies as a pilot research. So if Mel is interested in doing a larger non-case study research on creativity, she might start with few case studies to see if she can see patterns beginning to emerge and to also to figure out the best way to do further research. So this is called pilot research. To develop new theories. And what happens? Case studies often lead to new theories about psychological phenomena, either through pilot survey or through case studies on their own. So here what happens is Mel may notice that the businessman always does his best thinking early in the morning. So she can start developing a theory that early morning is the best time for creativity, which then can be tested with non-case study research. Okay. Thirdly is to challenge traditional theories. Now, science isn't perfect. There was time when scientists believed that the world was flat and the sun revolved around it. So we know it better. So what happens? Scientific theories are always being challenged. They are being modified. Case studies are sometimes used to challenge traditionally held scientific theories. So, for example, perhaps there's a well-established theory when we take this particular example that creative people they all have some type of mental illness. So, if in Mel's case, if she finds out that the businessman is creative but does not have any signs of mental illness, then her case study is challenging the traditional theory. Okay, so but what you can see here is all these three reasons that we have, they are linked to each other. Okay, so pilots, for example, pilot research, when we do that, can challenge traditional theories, which in turn can lead to development of new theories, right? From here you can start challenging, which helps in developing, right, in something new. So what are the steps that is involved? First, select a research strategy, then select a case. It could be multiple or single, and then selecting a depth. It could be a holistic case study. where you examine cases as a whole, which works more for a single, or an embedded case study where you examine just some aspects of the cases, which works more for single. Case works, which works more for single. Okay. Next is causal design, or is used for explanatory research. So it is basically consider when we start analyzing causality design, it's talking of understanding a phenomena in terms of conditional statements in the form like if X then Y. So it's basically used to measure what impact a specific change will have on existing norms and assumptions. Most social scientists actually try to find out the reasons, the causal reasons that reflect the test of hypothesis. Okay, and these causal effects can occur when variation in one phenomena, that is the independent variable, leads on an average in variation in another phenomenon, that's the dependent variable. So conditions necessary for determining the causality. One is empirical association, which is a valid conclusion is based on finding an association between independent and dependent variable. That is where we call evidence-based association. Second is appropriate time order, that is to conclude that causation was involved. One must see the cases were exposed to variation in the independent variable before variation in the dependent variable. And the third is non-spuriousness, which is a relationship between two variables that is not due to variation in a third variable. Okay, so these studies actually helps researchers to understand why the world works the way it does through the process of proving a causal link between variables and eliminating other possibilities. Replication is possible, and there is a greater confidence that the study has internal validity due to systematic subject selection and equity of groups being compared. And what these studies don't tell us, not all relationships are causal. The possibility always exists that by sheer coincidence, two unrelated events appear to be related. That can happen. Okay. So, where I give the example, say, in case if Phil could accurately predict the duration of winter for 5 consecutive years, but the fact remains that he's just a big furry rodent. Okay, but he could still do it. Conclusions about causal relationships are difficult to determine. Why? Due to a variety of extraneous and confounding variables that exist in a social environment, which means that causality, when we talk of causality, it can only be inferred, it can never be proven. And if two variables are correlated, cause must come before the effect. This is important, okay? Cause must come before the effect. So, but even though two variables might be related, causally related, sometimes it becomes difficult to determine which variable comes first, and therefore it's very difficult to establish which variable is the actual cause and which is the actual effect. So if you know, and this is a video which tells how the causal research is carried out. So this is an example that we have where we test the market for a new product by collecting data about its sales potential and to check the performance of or the effectiveness of a new advertisement campaign to decide whether to continue or not. These are all examples to measure the improvement in the performance of employee after providing them training on a new skill, or to examine the effects of a rebranding initiatives based on the level of loyalty of customers. Fourth is cohort design, which is mostly used in medical sciences, but can also be used in other type of applied social sciences, right? Which refers to a study being conducted over a period of time, which involves members of the population, which the subject or the representative member comes from. Okay, and who are united by some commonality or similarity. So using the quantitative framework, we have to use a quantitative framework. So we can make note of statistical occurrence within a specified subgroup unified by a similar or same characteristics which are relevant to a research problem being investigated. Cohorts means a group of people having similar characteristics which belongs to the entire population, right? Part of the population. So it's a subgroup with some special characteristics, right? Okay. Okay, so what happens? Like when we use this method, this research design, it generally helps in gathering data using methods of observation. So we can have open cohort studies or closed cohort studies. Open cohort studies, which involves a population that is defined just by the state of being a part of the study in question. Okay, date of entry and exit from the study is individually defined. So what happens? The size of the study population is not constant, right? So in when we talk of open cohort studies, you can only calculate rate based data, which is incidence rates, variance. Closed cohort studies is where which involves participants who enter into the study at one defining point in time, where it is presumed that no other participants would enter. Right. So what happens? The number of participants remains same throughout the study period. These studies actually is what tells us quite a lot of things. The use of these studies is often mandatory. Why? Because a randomized control study may be unethical, right? And that's, for example, you cannot deliberately expose people to asbestos. You can only study its effect on those who have been exposed, right? And because these studies measure the potential causes before the occurrence has occurred, so they can actually demonstrate that these causes are preceding the outcome. So you get to know what are the causes before, and that they are the ones which are coming first before the outcome. So the debate, avoiding debate, which is the cause, which is the effect. It's also highly flexible and can provide insights into effects over time and related to a variety of different types of changes. Either original data or secondary data can be used in this design. What these studies don't tell us. In cases where a comparative analysis of two cohort is made, research cannot control all other factors that might differ between these two groups. Okay, because you are looking into one particular type of factor and the difference, and then you study. So you cannot actually look into all the types of the factors of difference, factors that causes the difference between the two groups. That is very difficult. So these factors are known as confounding variables. Now, in this type of study, what happens is we can end up taking a long time to complete if the researcher has to wait for the conditions of interest to develop, okay, within that group. So it also increases a chance that the key variables, they might change during the course of study, which impacts the validity of the findings. And because of lack of randomization in this design, the external validity is lower than that of study designs where the researcher randomly assigns participants. Fifth is cross-sectional design, which these are designs having three distinct features. There is no time dimension, a reliance on the existing differences rather than change following intervention. Already the differences exist, and the groups that are selected based on existing differences rather than random allocation. So there's no dimension. Okay, so not a particular span of time, but over this period of time, the two groups, there is already a difference is already there when you select it, and the groups that is selected, they're based on the differences which already exist rather than where you start randomly allocating it. So it can measure, or it can measure only differences between or from among a variety of people, subjects, phenomenon, rather than change, right? So here what happens, researchers who use this design can only employ a relative passive approach to make causal inferences based on findings. And it also gives information about the sample at one given point of time, and it's at a particular particular point of time, but it does not explain the relationship, only tells you about the information, about the sample, about a particular point of time, but does not talk about the relationship. What these studies tell us, they provide a snapshot of the outcome and the characteristics associated with it at a particular point of time. Here, what happens is there is an active intervention by the researcher to produce and measure change or to create differences, right? It focuses on studying and drawing inferences from existing differences between people, subjects, phenomena. It helps in collecting data of and and concerning at one point of time collecting data which with regards to one particular point of time, right? So here what happens is we also focus on finding relationship between variables at one moment in time. It's not across a period of time at one moment. The groups which are identified for study are purposely selected based upon existing difference in the sample rather than seeking random sampling. The difference that is there, it will be there over a span of time. Okay, so it's already there. So and the next thing that comes up is these studies are capable of using data from a large number of subjects. It can also estimate the prevalence of an outcome of interest because a sample is usually taken from the whole population, right? And it's generally used for survey techniques. Use it you for gathering data for user. So survey techniques are used, right? So that which is why it's survey techniques, they are inexpensive and takes little time to conduct. Okay, right. So what these studies don't tell us, finding people, subjects, or phenomena to study which are very similar in one specific variable is very difficult to get. Results are static and time bound and does not give an indication of sequence of events or reveal historical concepts. It cannot be utilized to establish cause and effect relationships. It provides only a snapshot of the analysis. So there is always the possibility that a study could have differing results if another time frame is chosen. And there is no follow-up to the findings. So cross-sectional is when we're talking of it, it also can be used to describe characteristics that exist in a community, but not to determine the cause and effect relationships between different variables. So it's often used to make inferences about possible relationships or to gather preliminary data to support further research and experiments. So for example, researchers studying developmental psychology may select groups of people who are of different ages but investigate them at a one particular point of time. So by doing this, any differences in the age group can presumably be attributed to age differences rather than something that happened over time. Okay. Next is descriptive design, which helps in providing answers to questions as to who, what, when, where, how, associated with a particular research problem. It cannot conclusively ascertain answers as to why. Why cannot be done. Okay. So it's used to obtain information concerning the current status of the phenomena and to describe what exists with respect to variables or conditions in a situation. The subject is being observed in a completely natural and unchanged natural environment. So we can actually do this with the help of these studies, right? It is also used as a precursor to more quantitatively researched designs. If the limitations are understood, it can be used in developing a more focused study. Sorry, it can yield very rich data, which can lead to some important recommendations. And approach collects a large amount of data for detailed analysis. So you have to collect a lot of data. What these studies don't tell us, the results cannot be used to discover a definite answer or to disapprove a hypothesis. And because these designs are often utilize observational methods, the results cannot be replicated, right? So it heavily depends on instrumentation for measurement and observation. So these are the information that you have. If you see this website, you get more information. Say, for an example, an investor considering an investment in the ever-changing Amsterdam housing market needs to understand what the current state of the market is, how it changes, and when it changes before asking for the why. So this is where descriptive research comes on. So this is the website by YouTube, if you see this, which tells you more about this sort of research design. Seventh is experimental design, which is a blueprint of the procedure which enables us as researchers to maintain control of all the factors that may affect the result of an experiment. So in doing so, what happens is the researcher attempts to determine or predict what may occur. It's used where there is time priority in a causal relationship. Causal relationship means cause precedes effect. There is consistency in causal relationship, that is, a cause will always lead to the same effect, and the magnitude of the correlation is great, right? So it actually specifies an experimental group and a control group, where the independent variable is administered to the experimental group, not to the control group, and both groups are measured at this on the same dependent variable, right? And so, for instance, let's say if we say that a case where we have two groups, and we say that we have the theory, we say that if we give apple, if we eat apple a day, we go to doctor, the frequency of doctor's visit, going to the doctor or doctor's chamber, that decreases. So we have two groups. So we give one group apple to eat every day, one group we do not. So then we actually the group that we actually give apple, that's experimental group, and the group to whom we do not is the control group. And then we try to see how many times do they each group go to the doctor's clinic. Okay, so, and you can use these designs for more groups. Subsequently, experimental designs can be used for more groups, more measurements for over long period of time. And you must have control, randomization, and manipulation can happen. So we can just, this is what manipulation is like. We give one apple a day, then we can give two apples a day, and then we can make a change, and we don't give apples. So we have that power in our hand to do this manipulation, right? What do these studies tell us? They allow a researcher to control the situation, whereby it allows us to answer the question, what causes something to occur. It permits us as researcher to identify the cause and effect relationships between variables, and to distinguish placebo effects, that is assumed effects, from treatment effects. It supports the ability to limit alternative explanations and to infer direct causal relationships in the study. It provides the highest level of evidence for single studies. What these studies don't tell us is this design is artificial, results may not generalize to the real world. The artificial setting of experiments may alter subject behaviors or responses. It can be costly if special equipment or facilities are needed, right? And some research problems cannot be studied using experiment due to ethical or technical reasons. And it's difficult to apply ethnographic and other qualitative measures to experimental design research studies. Next comes up is exploratory design, which is conducted about a research problem when there are few or no further research studies have been done. Okay, so basically it's done to gain insights and familiarity for later investigation or undertaking when problems are in a preliminary stage of investigation where you do not have enough information. So you need to do an exploratory design. So the goals of exploratory design is to become familiar with the basic details, settings, and concerns, have a well grounded picture of the situation being developed, generation of new ideas and assumption, development of tentative theories and hypotheses, determination about whether a theory is feasible in the future. Issues get refined for more systematic investigation and formulation of new research problems or research questions, new research questions that come up. And it also provides direction for future research and techniques gets developed. What these studies tell us? It's a useful approach for gaining background information on a particular topic where you do not have sufficient information. It's flexible and it can address research questions of all type: what, why, how. Provides an opportunity to define new terms, clarify existing concepts. It's used to generate formal hypotheses, develop more precise research problems. It helps in establishing research priorities. What these studies don't tell us, it generally uses very small sample sizes, and so the findings are typically not generalizable to population as large. So sample size is less, and the exploratory nature of this type of research, it prohibits an ability to make definite conclusion about the findings. And here, what happens through this research process? It is when we you undertake the exploratory studies, but it is flexible, right? But it is often unstructured. Which means what? Unstructured means what? You do not have any specific set of questions. You can just go on, let people talk about it, just without intervention. So what happens? Which leads to only tentative results that have limited value in decision making, because it's our own perception that comes into play, right? So this design also lacks rigorous standards applied to methods for data collection and analysis, because what happens, one of the areas for exploration could be to determine what method or methodologies could best fit the research problem. Okay. Ninth is historical design, where the purpose is to collect, verify, and synthesize evidence from the past to establish facts and defend or refute the hypothesis, our hypothesis that we develop. So here we use secondary sources and a variety of primary documentary evidence, which is logs, diaries, official records, reports, some non-textual information. The limitation is that what happens, the sources must be both authentic and valid, otherwise we cannot conduct this research. This type of research design tells us a lot of things. Firstly, what happens is it's unobtrusive, where the action of research does not affect the results of study. It is well suited for trend analysis. It can add important contextual background, which is required to fully understand a research problem and interpret it. There's no possibility of the researcher subject interaction that could affect the findings. We do not interact with the respondents, right? So it can be used over and over to study different research problems, or we can replicate a previous study also. What these studies don't tell us, the ability to fulfill the aims of the research, it directly relates to the amount and quality of documentation available to understand the research problem. Some of these historical research, they relies on data on the past, where there is no way to manipulate it to control for contemporary context. Interpreting historical sources can be very time consuming. Time is a big factor. The sources that we use, they must be archived consistently to ensure access. Otherwise, it's difficult to get hold of these materials. The original authors bring in their perspectives and biasness for the interpretation of past events. And because of this, they are more difficult to ascertain in historical resources, right? Due to lack of control over external variables, this sort of research is very weak with regard to demands of internal validity. And what happens is, it's rare that the if the entirety of historical documentation is needed to fully address a research problem, is for interpretation. It is very rare to get it. If you want and you want to interpret a particular research problem, and you want the entire historical documentation which is there to address it, then it's very rare. So gaps need to be acknowledged, right? Next is longitudinal design, which follows the same sample over time and makes repeated observations, right? Here what happens is same sample over time, right? And same make repeated observations. So here the same group of people is interviewed at regular intervals, enabling researchers to track changes over time, to relate them to variables that might explain why changes occur, right? Cross-sectional is different groups, right? And it's there. But here it's the same group over time. So it helps to describe a pattern of change and help establish the direction and magnitude of causal relationships. And these measurements are taken on each variable over two or more distinct time periods, which allows us as a researcher to measure the change in variables over time, right? And it's a type of observational study. And sometimes it's also referred to as a panel study. What these studies tell us, it allows us to analyze the duration of a particular phenomena. It helps us to get close to the different kinds of causal explanations, which is usually attainable only with respect to experiments. It permits the measurement of differences or change in a variable from one period to another, okay, across time or period over, or as we say, over the period of time, where the description of patterns change over time. It also facilitates the prediction of future outcomes based on earlier factors. What these theories don't tell us, these studies, the data collection method can change over time. Maintaining the integrity of the original sample can be difficult over an extended period of time. It can also be difficult to show more than one variable at a time. This sort of design requires qualitative research to explain fluctuations in the data. It basically assumes present trends will continue unchanged. That's the assumption, that there won't be any change in the present trend. And it can take a long period of time to gather results. And there is a need to have a large sample size and accurate sample to reach representativeness. Okay, small sample will not work. The next one is observational design or field research, right? Where we draw a conclusion by comparing subjects against a control group in cases where the researcher has no control over the experiment. So there are generally two types of observational design. One is direct observation, where people know that you're watching them. Unobtrusive measures involve any method of studying behavior where people do not know that they are being watched. One where you watch, other where you do not know. They know your respondents know that they are being watched, and the other is your respondents do not know that they are being watched. So an observational study, it actually allows a useful insight into a phenomena and avoids the ethical and practical difficulties of setting up a large and very huge, cumbersome research projects. What do these studies tell us? They're usually flexible and they do not necessarily need to be structured around a particular hypothesis about what we expect to observe. We can collect a in-depth information about a particular behavior, and which can reveal the interrelationships amongst multifaceted dimensions of group interactions. We can generalize our results to real life situations. It's useful for discovering what variables may be important before applying other methods like experiments. And it accounts for the complexity of group behaviors. Why do people behave in this way they do? What these studies don't tell us, the reliability of data is low. Why? Because when we see behaviors occur over and over again, it may be a time consuming task and very difficult to replicate. The findings may only reflect a unique sample population and may not be may not be able to generalize to other groups. There can be problems with bias, as the researcher may see only what they want to see. There's no way to determine the cause and effect relationship because nothing is being manipulated. The sources or subjects may not be equally credible. Any group that is studied, if it is altered to some degree by the very presence of researcher, so what happens? The data becomes skewed, right? That can get skewed because due to the presence of the researcher, when we know that a person is watching, our behavior changes. 12th is philosophical design. So it's basically where it's intended to challenge deeply embedded assumptions which are related to a particular area of study. And it uses the tools of argumentation derived from philosophical traditions, concepts, models, and theories to critically explore challenge. See, for instance, the relevance of logic and evidence in academic debates, to analyze arguments about fundamental issues, discuss the root of existing discourse about a research problem. And this particular tool of analysis can be framed in three ways. One is called ontology, which is a study that describes the nature of reality. That is, for example, what is real, what is not, what is fundamental, what is derivative. Second is epistemology, which is a study that explores the nature of knowledge. That is, on what does knowledge and understanding depend on? How can we be certain of what we know? Third is axiology, that is a study of values. Say, for example, what values does an individual or group hold and why? This is an example. What these studies tell us provides a basis for applying ethical decision making to practice, functions as a means of gaining greater self understanding, self knowledge about the purpose of research, brings clarity to general guiding practices and principles of a group or an individual. It informs the methodology, refines concepts and theories that are invoked in relatively unreflective modes of thought and discourse. And it also informs critical thinking about epistemology and the structure of reality. It helps in clarity and definition to the practical and theoretical uses of certain norms, theories, norms, concepts, or ideas. What these theories don't tell us, it's limited application to specific research problems. So, which where we say, so what, right? Analysis can be abstract, argumentative, and limited in its practical applications to real life issues. So, what happens here is, while a philosophical analysis may render problematic that which was once simple or taken for granted, writing can be dense and subject to unnecessary jargon, overstatement, excessive quotation, and documentation. There can be limitations in the use of metaphor as a vehicle for philosophical analysis, and there can be analytical difficulties also in moving from philosophy to advocacy, between abstract thought and application to the phenomenal world. So, the 13th design is sequential design, which is carried out in a deliberate, staged approach. Right? It's a serial manner, serially done. Sequence means serial, done in a serial form. It's done, or we say done serially, where one stage will be completed, followed by another, then another. Serially, it's done serially, right? And with the main aim that each stage will be built upon the previous one until we have enough data to be gathered over an interval period of time to test a hypothesis. The sample size is not determined beforehand, it's not predetermined. So after each sample is analyzed, the researcher can accept the null hypothesis, accept the alternative hypothesis, or select another group of subjects and conduct the study again. Which means what? The researcher can do and can obtain a limitless number of subjects. You can you can actually work on like you can an n number of people before you finally make a decision whether to accept the null or alternative hypothesis. So we use a quantitative framework, and it using this study, which helps in it helps in utilizing the sampling technique for gathering data, applying these statistical methods to analyze the data. Right? If we use a qualitative framework, then it usually helps in utilizing samples of individuals or group of individuals, that is cohorts, and use qualitative methods such as interviews or observations to gather information about each group. So quantitative is one way where you want to gather data and do a statistical analysis. You can use a qualitative method where what we use is we select the sample and or groups of samples of individuals or groups of individuals, and then we use interviews or observation methods to gather information about each sample. Okay, so what does these studies tell us? There is a limitless option when it comes to sample size and sample schedule. Due to repetitive nature of this research design, minor changes and adjustments can be made during the initial part of study to actually become more expert on this research method, to have a correctly use it. So it's useful design where the exploratory studies are concerned. There's very little effort on the part of researcher when performing this technique. It's not expensive. It's not time consuming or it's not expensive, right? It's not time consuming and also not workforce extensive. And so what happens is, because the study is conducted serially, the results of one sample is known before the next sample is taken and analyzed. You get to know the results before you take the next sample. So what these studies don't tell us, it's not representative of the entire population. The only probability of approaching representativeness happens when the researcher chooses to use a very large sample size, significant enough to represent a significant portion of the entire population, right? So what happens, but in this case, moving from one sample to the second sample may be difficult, right? And because this technique is not randomized, the design that we use, it cannot be used to create conclusions and interpretations that can be applied to the entire population. So the generalizability from findings is limited, and it's difficult to account for and interpret variation from one sample to another over time, particularly when using qualitative methods of data collection, right? So this is the research design where we are talking about. All right, so we are highlighting now on the measurement and measures. So when we talk of measurement of variables, what is measurement? It's the assignment of numbers or other symbols to characteristics or objects according to a pre-specified set of rules. Objects is, it could be persons, strategic business units, companies, countries, and so on and so forth. Characteristics of objects could be arousal seeking, tendency, achievement, motivation, organizational effectiveness, and so on and so forth. Example. Okay. Attributes of sub-objects that can be physically measured by some calibrated instruments pose no measurement problems when we are measuring it, right? So for example, if you measure the length and width of a table, it can be easily done with a measuring tape or ruler. Data representing demographic characteristics of employees can be obtained by easily asking questions to the employees. Abstract and subjective variables, they are harder to measure. That's where we talk of our emotions, motivate, effectiveness, feelings comes into play. It's difficult to measure. So the levels of scale measurement. What is scale? It's a tool or mechanism by which individuals are distinguished as to how they differ from one another on the variables of interest of study. First level is nominal, which is where its attributes are only named and it's the weakest. Then ordinal, where attributes can be ordered, like we can order them. Interval, where distance is measured, and ratio, where we talk of absolute zero. So you see this is the example. This is nominal. Then ordinal, where we are looking at the positions, and interval is where we talk of the time gap, and ratio, where we are comparing minutes and the distance traveled. We are making a ratio of it. So nominal scale is it places data into categories with no order, and it often uses names or numbers with no numerical attached, male, female, employed, unemployed. So from statistical viewpoint, it's a lowest form of measurement. This is an example. Ordinal scale, it allows us to arrange things based on how much of some concept they possess, right? So it allows us to identify the order of a factor. We are ordering it without relative positional distance. The distance is not measured, only the order. See, if we see the top 3 Olympic runners, so fastest may be far superior to second, but that's what it is, right? But there's no way to represent it. We are not looking into the time, but we just identify the order. We are not looking into the position, relative position, right? So this is the example. Interval, when we talk of interval scale, it has both nominal and ordinal properties and captures information about differences in quantities of a relative of a particular concept. That is, it reveals order and intervals. See, the order is there as well as the interval, right? And next is ratio scale. It has properties of interval scales. Along with that, an additional attribute of representing absolute quantities, a scale that has a true 0 point, and it's not commonly used or found in social sciences, right? So this is an example that we have. This you can do as this is an activity where where you can actually find out which is nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. So measuring attitudes measuring. So what is attitude? It's an any enduring disposition to consistently respond in a given manner to various aspects of world. It could be the different components are, one is cognition, where we talk of knowledge and belief about an object, situation, person. Affect, that's our feelings or emotions towards that object, situation, or feeling. Behavior is where we it's predisposition to action, intentions, behavioral expectations. Why do we measure attitudes? It's may if you talk from the business point of view, most managers have the belief that the changing consumer behavior of consumers and employees towards their company and their products, that's is a major goal, right? So that's which they have to measure it, and it's important because modifying attitudes, it plays a very crucial role in developing future strategies which would address all these goals. All right, so how do we measure attitudes? First is there are four ways to do it. Ranking, where we require the respondents to rank the order objects in overall performance on the basis of particular characteristics or stimulus. Second is rating, where we ask the respondents to estimate the magnitude of a characteristics or quality that an object possesses by indicating on a scale where he or she would rate an object. Third is sorting, where we present the respondent with various concepts typed on cards and require the respondents to arrange the cards into order to a number of piles or otherwise classify. We ask them to classify the concepts, sort it out. Okay, and the fourth is choice, where we ask any respondent to choose one alternative from all the several alternatives, where we assume that the chosen alternative is preferred over the others, right? So attitude rating scales, a simple attitude rating scale, it requires that an individual agree or disagree with a statement or respond to a particular single question, and it actually classifies respondents into one or two categories, yes or no. This is an example. Next is category scale, which is a more sensitive measure where it can have more than two responses. You see, there are more than two. Third is method of summated ratings. It's an example, good example is a Likert scale, right? Where respondents indicate their own attitudes by checking how strongly they agree or disagree with statements. So some typical response alternatives could be strongly agree, uncertain, disagree, strongly disagree, right? So this is an example. Fourth is semantic differential scale, where a series of 7 point rating scales with bipolar objectives such as good and bad, anchoring the ends of the scales. You see this? Exciting, calm, opposite. Interesting, dull, simple, complex, passive, active, just opposite. And weight is assigned to each position on the scale. So scores could be from 7 to 1, right? And because it's a 7 point, or we can start from +3 to -3. There can be other rating scales also, which is graphical scale, where a measure of the attitude that allows respondents to rate an object by choosing any point of the graphic continuum, right? It allows the researcher to choose any interval desired for scoring purposes. This is the best 10 and this is the worst, right? Okay, so next comes up is sampling. We talk of population and sample. This is the next part, right? Sampling, see this picture? We can't always examine the entire population, right? So what is the solution? We go for sampling. but we need to make sure that the sample is representative. So, what is population? It's the entire group of people, events, or even things of interest that the researcher wishes to investigate. So, it's a group of people, events, or things of interest for which the researcher wants to make inferences that's based on sample statistics. A single member of the population is called element. A sample is a subset or a subgroup of population, and every single member of the sample is called subject. Sampling unit is an element or set of elements which is available for selection in the sampling process. See, for instance, there are 180 elderly people living in a nursing home, and 30 of them have to be interviewed by the nursing home administrator to actually assess the level of satisfaction with the food. So 150 is the population and 30 is the sample, right? So sampling is the process of selecting a sufficient number of right elements from the population so that the results from analyzing the sample, that is understanding its properties and characteristics, make it possible to generalize to the population. So we analyze the sample, and that should be able, from there we should be able to come to a conclusion about the entire population. So how do we do it? To sampling, we first define the population, right? Then determine the sample frame, then determine the sampling design, then start choosing the right sample size, and then execute the sampling process. So defining the population is it's where we talk of defining the target population in terms of elements, geographical boundaries, and time. Sampling frame is the all the list of population elements from which the sample is drawn, right? There could be two types of sampling design: probability sampling, non probability sampling. Probability sampling, where elements in the population have a known and a zero chance of being chosen as sample objects. So either you will be selected or you will not be. Everyone has an equal opportunity. Whereas non probability sampling is the elements in the population do not have a known and non-zero chance of being selected as elements, as subjects. Why? Because the researcher already has decided whom to select beforehand. So sampling design, when we talk of sampling design, we said first, as we said, is probability sampling. So these are the four different types of sampling that we have, right? Simple random sampling, systematic sampling, stratified sampling, cluster sampling. So here what happens? Representatives of the sample is of importance in the interest of wider generalizability of the findings, right? So sample should represent the entire population so that the results can be generalized to the entire population. So let's see the different types of sampling that we have. Simple random sampling, where each element has a equal and known and equal chance of being selected. It can be highly generalizable, least bias, easily understood. Reliable population frame is necessary and not always practical, right? So that's simple random sampling. Or systematic sampling, where each nth element starting with random choice of an element between 1 and n. It's easier than simple random sampling. Systematic biases occur when elements are not randomly listed. Stratified random sampling, where we divide the entire population in strata, include all strata, include from all the strata is included. We select random selection of elements from each strata is selected. So we are including all the strata. It's proportionate, it could be disproportionate. And there is interstrata heterogeneity and intrastratum homogeneity. Okay, so different strata are heterogeneous, within the strata is homogeneous. So it includes all relevant subpopulation. Now, cluster sampling, where we divide the population in clusters, random selection of clusters happen. We take out one cluster, right? Include all elements from selected clusters. Everyone gets elected. It gets selected. And intercluster homogeneity. With different clusters are homogeneous. Within a cluster that is heterogeneous, which is representing the entire population. So it's easy, convenient, and cost effective, and low correspondence, but low correspondence with reality. Okay. Next is non-probability sampling, These are the three types: convenience sampling, judgment sampling, quota sampling. So researchers may at times be less concerned about generalizability than obtaining some preliminary information in a quick and inexpensive way, right? So this, as a sampling technique, qualitative research generally uses non-probability sampling. Okay, as it is not done to aim, it's not done with the aim to draw statistical inference. So it's a technique which is often employed in qualitative investigation. The subjects are selected on the basis of expertise in the subject that is investigated. And it's very important that the subjects are chosen in a way that they reflect the diversity of the population. So these are the three different types. Convenient sampling is where collection of information from members of the population who are conveniently available to provide, right? Shoppers at shopping mall, delegates attending trade show. It's most often used during the exploratory phase of a research or project, is perhaps the best way of obtaining some basic information very quickly and efficiently. Judgment sampling, where it involves people who are best placed to provide the information, sort experts, right? So where we talk of expert employees, here what happens, the subjects who could reasonably be expected to have expert knowledge by virtue of having gone through the experiences, processed themselves, and might perhaps be able to provide good information, or data to the researcher because they are experienced, the experts. It's used when a limited number of people or category of people have the information that is needed, and it may restrict generalizability of findings. Third is quota sampling, which ensures certain groups are adequately represented in the study through the assignment of quota. It's used when a subset of a population is underrepresented, say minority groups in an organization, and may not be totally representative of a population. So again, it restricts generalizability of findings because we are only targeting that group which is underrepresented, right? So sample size, when choosing the sample size, we need to consider the degree of accuracy required, the sensitivity of the measuring instrument, time and budget. In general, sample size should be some between 30 to 500. Categories: 30 per subcategory. Multivariate is 10 into number of variables. Experiments: 15 to 20 per condition. So this is the general thing. You need to remember sampling design decisions. They are important aspects of research design. Okay. And that includes both the sampling plan and the sample size. Okay. On the other hand, when we talk of probability sampling plans, right, it leads to what? It lend themselves to generalizability, and non-probability sampling plans, they offer convenience and timely information, right? So probability sampling plans helps us in making a prediction about the entire population. Generalizability happens. Non-probability sampling plans, it offers convenience and timely information, right? That's all that we have from here. Okay. So if you have any questions, you can tell me, right? And we will discuss the rest in the next class.